Hello and welcome to another episode of Sum It Up. I'm Joelle Martinez, President and CEO of the Latino Leadership Institute, and I speak on behalf of Harry and myself. Do we have a show for you today? Heavy is the hustle, healing for leaders who carry it all. And Harry was just saying before we went live, I'm not just going to interview, I am going to be the solutions. And I feel that way too. As a leader today, trying to navigate this season that we're in, I feel it all of it. And, nearly every day we're talking about mental health and, self-care as an organization, but feel like we have to bring that to community. We have to talk about the real stuff open and honestly. We got to find solutions for ourselves. I think back to my grandmother always telling me, Mija, you're no good for anyone else if you're not good to yourself first. And that is what today's show is all about. And there is no one that Harry and I would invite to this conversation other than our friend, someone we both have just mad respect for. She also happens to be part of our LLI familia, and that is Marisol Solarte-Erlacher. She is an award-winning therapist. She is a licensed psychotherapist, a keynote speaker. She helps individuals and organizations tackle this very important topic. And I got to tell you, I just am a lucky person to ever be even close to her orbit. So Marisol, on behalf of our whole community, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
So much. It's such a generous introduction. Thank you. I'm just glad to be in your orbit and so grateful to be here to have this conversation.
Harry, I'll let you kick us off because you have been waiting for this one for a really long time.
Absolutely. Where's my chair, my couch that I lay down on so Marisol can help heal me. But Marisol, thank you again for joining us. And before we kind of dive into your work and we talk about healing and leadership, let's just I want to take a step back, and can you talk about how you got into this work and why you got into this work?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that it was a very long, circuitous path to get me to the field of therapy. I always say I'm the oldest daughter in a Latinx family, and so I fell into the perfect profession. I felt like I was parentified, so I was a little mother very early. I felt very responsible. I was, high achieving, and felt like I had this maturity that came to me very early. And I think part of that was just adapting to my environment. I come from a family of immigrants. I come from both parents who my parents were teenagers when I was born. My mom's 16, my dad's 17. And so there were a lot of challenges in terms of my childhood, me having to grow up with my parents, navigating, I think, just culture and understanding who I was in the midst of that. And so I think a lot of it was just my own personal journey led me to this work. And really, first and foremost, I thought about how could I best serve my community? And initially, I really thought, I see so many people suffering with substance use disorder. And I thought that would be my path. And then as I started to do the work, I realized, most people who are struggling with substance use or other issues like depression, anxiety, it's typically related to some traumatic event in their past. And so that's how I ended up being a trauma therapist, and felt really lucky to be able to do the work. And I think started really in working with survivors of very traumatic developmental issues. And so that's been the core of my work, and just feel really lucky to have been able to do it for this long.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That resonates with me a lot as the oldest grandchild, oldest child, with also teenage parents and teenage grandparents. So you take on this role of advisor, of mentor, of decision maker, and healer, I think, in that, especially in Latino families. So I completely relate to that. Part of your work in trauma has also bridged over to really helping leaders. And, especially I think in the social sector and in organizations that are on the ground doing the work alongside community, do face things like trauma and we don't talk about it. But talk to us a little bit about the emotional weight of leadership as you've seen it through your work. What toll does leadership take? And how have you really honed in on that as a practice today?
Yeah. So part of the work that I do now, working, as you say, Joel, with organizations, I really do some of that, on the ground, frontline work was really based on the pandemic. So, similar to what we're experiencing today, we all we're going through a collective trauma. And a lot of organizations obviously were transitioning to work from home. People were, obviously we were in lockdown, and people were experiencing intense feelings around what was happening, and a lot of their, either past traumas or current traumas were being triggered. And so a lot of my friends who are CEOs and executive directors asked me to come in and speak to their staff to see how I could help alleviate some of that and to give them some skills. And I think within that context, I realized that, organizations and people who are trying to guide those organizations, they are carrying a weight around how they lead, how they show up, and then how they hold the emotional space for the people that they're charged to lead. I think a lot of times people want to separate our emotional lives from the work that we do, and it's absolutely impossible. We are feeling emotional needs. I always quote this author of this book called Stroke of Luck, and she was a neuroscientist who had a stroke. And through her own healing, she started to understand her own. You probably know this, Joel, because you do so much around the neurobiology and leadership. And so part of what she talks about is that we believe that we're thinking beings that feel sometimes, when we are actually feeling that think sometimes. We spend most of our time feeling what's happening in our experience, and we're always having emotions. I think they say the research bears out that it's probably like 800 emotions that we feel in one day. And so there's so much for leaders to take on. You can't dismiss as a leader that people come with all of their emotional selves to the workplace. And so it's such an important thing, because if leaders aren't tuned into their own emotional worlds and what's happening for them, it's going to take a toll. And, I've seen leaders burn out. I mean, I'm sure you all have, doing this work and doing the intensity of this work. And, I think particularly now when we are under this intense scrutiny and intense pressure and intense uncertainty, leaders take an extreme hit in that, because people are looking to them for guidance, and they have to hold their own emotional space and then the space for so many others.
Before I turn it back over to Harry, I want to thank you. I think you just put words to so many thoughts. I mean, actually, my brain is trying to catch up with you right now, Marisol, because, I think as a female, especially a Latina leader, I think we're afraid to be emotional. And I know we'll get into this a little bit. But particularly during COVID, as leaders, you didn't want to show any sense of emotion or weakness, because you do carry the weight of everyone around you, and you're afraid to show any cracks, because you feel obligated to be strong in that. And that neuroscience and that neurobiology was a really important backbone for me to understand and to process as a leader, that not only was it okay to be emotional, but my emotions were actually helping me lead the way that I was supposed to lead in that moment. And I just thank you for saying that. Thank you for putting words and wisdom to that, because sometimes we can second guess it. So I just wanted to amplify that.
Well, I appreciate that, Joel. And I really do think that that's true. I think particularly for people of color, I think we are burdened with this sense of either overworking to prove our value, because we are devalued in so many ways externally, and or we have to have this presentation that we have it all together, because there isn't space for our emotional world. So I think, to your point, part of what I really work on with leaders, and I work on in organizations, and I think in all the work that I do, is that emotions are a signal to help us understand ourselves and to help us understand how to lead. And if we can do that work, it's such a powerful opportunity for us as leaders. I've been thinking conceptually a lot about how leadership can be a journey of healing. It really allows ourselves the opportunity to get to know who we are. Because when we're in leadership, we're confronted with ourselves. People hold a mirror to us all the time. Like, here's who you are, or why aren't you doing this? Or can't you do this better? And it's like, and we can either take on that charge to be self-reflective and to figure out how to show up. Or, I think sometimes people choose a different path and they don't use it as an opportunity of self-reflection.
Marisol, that load you're talking about that you take on as a leader, you have the one aspect that you just talked about on taking care of yourself, but coming with leadership means you're taking on the load of others. And now that I imagine that load is amplified 100 times, and whether it's emotional or spiritual or physical, how do you lead effectively and with empathy and at the same time take care of yourself?
Mm-hmm. I think first and foremost, Sherry, and this is I think the hardest thing, because I think self-care is so ubiquitous. Like, we talk about self-care and we talk about like, make sure you're okay, and as a leader, take time for yourself, take time off. And for a lot of people, that's not possible. Like, there's a level of intensity, and I think there's just a pace right now that doesn't allow people to have that space. Or what the tendency is, like, let me take a week off and then kind of try to like recoup and come back to myself and then come back into the work that I'm doing. And there's no change in the way that we're doing the work. So I think first and foremost, I think it's really doing a self-assessment around how am I talking to myself about what's currently happening. And that seems very like a small step, but it's super impactful, because what happens is we typically become very hard on ourselves. When our stress increases, that typically, if we haven't really dealt with our internal self-criticism and how we treat ourselves internally, that tends to go up too. And so those two things together creates a really difficult situation where we're not able to really truly take care of ourselves and be compassionate, empathic, and kind to ourselves. And I think that in itself fundamentally changes the way we're able to show up. And it really allows us to figure out, what do I need in the moment, as opposed to putting off what I need in the moment and then just projecting into the future. Because what typically happens, like, I was saying, it's like I'm just going to like make it through July. And
yes.
Through Thursday. I'm going to make it through Thursday.
Let me make it until, I have 12 more days until I have to I can give myself a break. And that is not sustainable. Like, we just know that physically, our nervous system, the way that our nervous system is impacted by that, it has long-term physiological and psychological effects. And so part of it is like, the more that I'm tuned into myself with self-compassion and understanding, then I can help myself know, like, what do I actually need in this moment and not just in the future? And how can I give myself the grace to know that even if I mess up and fail, or if I don't do it all, or if I don't meet whatever expectation that I have for myself or that others have for me, it's going to be okay. Like, I can give myself a little bit more space. And so I think that's really the first step.
No, thank you. I'm going to keep that to heart. You made me think about how many times, and I know, Joel, you said the same thing. Let's just can we get to Friday? Forget like getting through the month. But no, and literally, I mean, I'm watching the comments just light up, Marisol, on this particular point, just so you know, because I know so much of our networking community sit in these positions, and this is so just personal to them. So, again, just, thank you, and just know you're reaching a lot of people that this is resonating with.
No, and I really do. I really am passionate about this because of my own personal journey. Like, I'm in a position, I'm uniquely positioned in that I'm a helper. Most of my work has been working with people to help them in their most distressing moments. And I burnt myself out, because even though I knew all the things, and I'm sure Joel can attest to this, even though I knew all the things, I wasn't living the things. And I think as leaders, that's the most important. Like, we tell our staff, or we tell the people that we are in charge of, take time off, take a PTO, make sure you take care of yourself. But if we are not doing that for ourselves, none of that will translate to future. None of that will shift people treat themselves. Like,
you'll do as I say, not as I do, right?
actually, I did this capsule podcast on leadership and healing leadership. And one of the things that I talked about with, and a lot of it was just me talking. So it was just solo episodes, but I was interviewing someone, and one of the things that I was talking about was there's this concept like in attachment theory, so in parenting theory, that kids don't treat themselves the way that you treat them. They treat themselves the way you treat yourself.
Ooh,
So, I know. Whew.
that's like a whole layer of
Wait a minute. Time out.
Yeah, that is serious.
I think that translates to leadership too, because people are looking to you as an example, and they will not treat themselves the way that you tell them to treat themselves. They will treat themselves the way you treat yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's hitting, yeah, I mean, bullseye there. And that just adds to the weight too, I mean, it's like this piling on of the expectations and knowing that you carry that kind of responsibility is not a light, it's not a lightweight to carry, because self-reflection is really the foundation for everything else that comes after. What are, walk us through the things, how do you know, like, what are these signs of burnout? What are the signs that the stress and anxiety, what are the signs that you are on the verge of just physical, emotional reckoning, that you can't do it all, that it's too heavy, that you need to take time out? What are some of the things we should be thinking about during that self-reflection?
No, that's such a great question. And this is something that I talk about and train about all the time. I talk about this concept of the window of tolerance. So we all have a capacity to tolerate the distress in our lives. And so within that window, we have the capacity to be able to think about what we're feeling. So I may feel overwhelmed emotionally, but I can think about what's happening inside of me. So I can say, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. Let me go and take a break. Or I know that this has been really hard this week, so let me figure out how to take care of myself. So we have the capacity to understand what we're feeling when we're in that window of tolerance. When we're out of that window of tolerance, we move between hyperarousal and hypoarousal. So hyperarousal is when we're overthinking, anxious, emotionally overwhelmed, angry. We're just feeling like, we come home at the end of the day and we're feeling emotionally edgy around our family. Like we're ready to just like pop off at any time. And just, so we tend to feel very activated in our system. If we move into hypoarousal, we're like shut down, depressed, like what's the point? Let me just like bed rot and watch, 20 hours of Netflix this weekend, and then I'll come back. And so when we move into those states, we're typically in a state of chronic stress. And so what becomes really important in that self-reflection, and I feel is really important as a first step, is start to think about, how do I know when I'm either in hyperarousal or hypoarousal? So for myself, I'm typically one who moves towards hypoarousal. So I'm tend to want to shut down, isolate, and kind of like, disconnect. Some people can feel that emotional edginess where I can't sleep at night. I'm up at 3 a.m. and I have racing thoughts and I can't sleep. Those are all signals to you that you are in that activated state. And so once you know how that shows up in your body and yourself, then you can see them before they get to the state of I'm completely unaware now, and I'm just living in that state of hypoarousal for over long periods of time. So that's really important because it allows us some insight before we actually get to that place where it's too much.
And do you have, Marisol, on that point, are there any daily habits or rituals or things you could do? One, obviously, that you have to, and you want to deal with it when you're in the moment. Ideally, you would like to avoid getting to that moment. And I'm kind of, looking you around. What are things you could start to do, implement in your life, in your everyday life, to hopefully either, not get there, or at least limit the amount of times you reach that chronic area?
Yeah. So what I tell people is that, so when we think about chronic stress is it's the thing that impacts us as individuals. Like all of the studies show that in terms of health outcomes, chronic stress is at the top of the list in terms of negative health outcomes. And so it has a very significant physiological effect. Like we get sick because of stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so what becomes really important is to, do the opposite of that on a daily basis. So we are constantly faced with stressors and that impact the way that we're able to show up. So we have to build in ways, even small, over short periods of time that help calm our nervous system down, because it has the same impact. The more that I'm calming my nervous system down, I'm kind of, putting money in that bank so that I can have a bigger window of tolerance to tolerate the stressors. So what I tell people is just build in tiny little things. It's really hard because sometimes I do meditate daily, but I have to be very intentional about like, I'm going to do it before I get out of my bed.
It's all going to be lost.
Right? I'm going to the gym. I'm doing my thing. It's like, I can't step back. So build times of reflection and just checking in with yourself in really moments that you're going to do it. So I tell people, if you work from home, when you open that laptop, take 30 seconds and just check in with yourself. And then take a breath. Notice yourself in this moment, because you're putting into that bank of your nervous system to calm yourself.
Wow.
You can have I think sometimes when we think about stressors, we think like, well, I'm just always going to be stressed. I'm just going to ride that wave forever. You can build small intentional ways to build the capacity of your nervous system. Like we all have the agency to do that. I think the other piece here, and I'll just mention this quickly, is sometimes when we're embedded, I always talk about like when we're on the dance floor, like you don't know what's happening around you. You're just like in your flow. And it's similar when we're in our work lives. Like we're in our flow, doing our thing, and we're like, I'm just going to have to deal with the stress. We don't have perspective. We don't get on the balcony of our own lives and look down and say, actually, maybe I need to do something different, or I need to look at how these systems that I've created are impacting my life. Because whether intentionally or not intentionally, we all have a system that we create, which is the way that we live our lives daily. So sometimes we need another person to be accountable to say, you know what, I see this happening to you, and you need to take a minute and breathe, because we don't get that perspective most of the time.
Yeah, I'm really lucky. I'm surrounded by an amazing team, and probably a topic for another day, but I've pushed myself to the edge many times over. And it is always my team that is a reminder and holding me accountable and reminding me truly I'm not good for them if I'm not taking care of myself first. So absolutely. And I think that kind of leads to my next question. And that is, particularly for Latinos, community is our heart, it's our soul. It also can be part of our healing and our strength. And I would love to hear your perspective, because anyone who knows you knows how you love community and you're there for community. But what role do you think community can play in this conversation, in this moment, in this season, but in our everyday lives?
I think it's absolutely fundamental and critical. I think that in this moment in time where we are culturally here in the United States, part of the issue of our, not only the mental health crisis, but where we are just, I think the political landscape, is because we have become so individualistic that we don't think about the collective. And part of what we know in terms of our community is that the collective is everything. And so I think about our own healing, and I'm reminded, I'm very lucky, Joel. I think, I have you all as part of my community, even though I don't get to see you as often, but I have people that are very close to me that we talk a lot about how sometimes we tend to isolate ourselves, and we bring ourselves back and say, we are meant to be in community. Like we're meant to be with each other and heal each other. And when we have those fears and anxieties, and most of the time it's because we believe that we're alone. Most people who come to therapy are symptomatic because they believe that they're the only ones having that experience. Most people deal with chronic anxiety or deal with a sense of overwhelm or depression, and they think, I'm the only one who's having this experience. When most of the time, all of us have had that experience. And so part of community is being able to say, I've been there, to normalize what we're experiencing, to say, I see you. And that's the power of community, like to be felt and seen in that way. I always tell people, like, if you choose the therapist, people want to be like, I want the therapist with like the PhD and all the certificates and all the skills and all, which is great. And that's really meaningful. But it's really about feeling seen, heard, and understood. That's the power of therapy. And that's the power of community, is that I can come to you and, I think being, Latinx and we have a shared experience and we don't have to use words, a lot of words to explain it. And I think that's the power, is that I can come to you and we can come to each other and say, I hear you and I feel you and I'm here.
On that, Marisol, on that come to you, whether it's the community, whether it's someone with kind of background expertise you have. For some of us, one of the cultural aspects we deal with is, and I'll even, open up with it. Like I've heard, toughen up, you're fine, you're built for this, just go through it. And then you kind of, you try to put that cape and that shield on and just say, I'm going to go at this alone.
Yep.
How do you combat that? Because you got to still get to, I actually need help. I got to be a little bit more vulnerable, whether it's community, whether it's a doctor like yourself. How do you get there? And there is this little clash a little bit with culture there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember the first time I stepped into a therapy office, I was 19 years old. And I sat in my car for 30 minutes before I stepped into that office trying to convince myself to go in. Because there was this cultural, these unwritten rules that you shouldn't cry in front of people, you need to be strong. And we don't talk about what happens in our family outside of our family. And I was like, you need to get in there, you need to do it. So I totally understand those barriers. I think what we need to understand is that, and I always, whenever a client would come in, especially monolingual Spanish speakers, who are immigrants to this country, I would say, I know that you believe that only people who go to therapy are crazy. And that's not true. You're coming here because you believe in yourself and you want to help yourself. And so I think of it more as an investment in me. I don't think about it as like, because I have fallen trapped to that, like, you know what, just like suck it up, keep it moving. You know what I mean? You're stronger than this, or whatever that narrative is. But I've come to realize that self-compassion and self-reflection is really where the strength comes from. Yeah. And so I think overcoming the barrier is really, I think talking openly to people, because most people are in therapy but don't talk about it. Yeah. I talk about it all the time. People are like, you've been in therapy for a long time. I'm like, yeah, I'll probably do it until my last breath. And I say it, and it's a very vulnerable thing, even as a therapist, to say, I've been in therapy for 30 years and I'll keep doing it. But I say it because our culture, especially Latinx culture, there's not a normalization of mental health interventions. And there's not a normalization of, it's not about being crazy. It's just about seeking support. Because when you have a professional who is trained to give you that support that you need, it's transformative. And it changes not only yourself, but your family, your community. I always tell my dad, I always joke with him because, he's, and if he's listening, sorry, Dad. He's always like, I don't need therapy, whatever. And I always tell him, I'm like, you might not think you need therapy, but imagine how your kids would feel. Just taking that step. Just saying, I'm going to go, think about myself and reflect on my life and, our relationship. That would transform. You wouldn't even have to do very much. Yeah. And so I just think the power of that can be an impetus for taking that first step.
I think this is so, we know, right? The data tells us that we suffer from these mental health issues, and yet we're at least 60% less likely to seek out help. The stigma, access to it, having, Marisols in our network to go to have that familiarity, to be seen, to not have to, feel judged. And maybe we can't solve all those things, but what can we do as leaders today to model, to create space, to normalize, so that the next generation following behind us as the next up and coming leaders don't fall into those same patterns? How do we help others feel a sense of safety and normalization. What is some advice you'd give us to be better leaders in that space?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's practicing vulnerability, but not vulnerability in the way that I'm just oversharing about what's happening in my life. It's about saying, I struggle too. And here's what I do when I struggle. It's about being the coach that you needed or that you need to other people, to be able to say, yeah, this is really hard. And here, like here we're talking about, like, here are all these ways that I struggle, like this is painful, this is hard. And here's what I'm trying to do for myself. And here's what I'm thinking about, what is it that you think about doing for yourself to help yourself? It's like bringing that vulnerability and curiosity to the spaces where you are in can be transformative, because you're showing people that you are willing to be yourself authentically. And it allows people to show up authentically and then potentially be courageous.
Marisol, on that point, I want to bring it kind of personal, because we have the leadership role at work, but you also have a leadership role as a parent.
Yeah.
And any tidbits for parents to help their kids as young as possible to think about different, and maybe, learnings you could pass on and how they could operate differently, especially, I think about a future world of them. And if we think it's chaotic now, we think about technology and AI and the amount of information, and we're nascent in this. iPhone's only, like 20 years old. Like, everyone talks like technology. We've been here for a while. We're brand new. We're just getting into a world where everything's going to be hyper to that. How do we better prepare the next generation of our leaders coming out of our communities?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot, because I do sometimes get overwhelmed by some of the, AI. I think about, if anyone's read The Anxious Generation, like, we're moving into a place where, young people aren't coming together as much. There's an epidemic of loneliness. There's so many things that, and we think about global warming and, the climate crisis and what's going to, the economy. My son is always talking about, he's 16 years old, and he's like, I can't live in Denver. I want to stay in Denver, and I can't live here. And so I think about those things, and I can get crushed by the sense of overwhelm and the fear. And so what I think about a lot, and I think this is a really helpful thing for leaders, is what if we collectively imagine a world that we want, and really focus on that, because we can get stuck. And we just, as human beings, have a negativity bias, because we're built to survive. Like, we're always thinking about, what's the next thing I need to prepare for? And so I always think about, what's the world that I want to imagine? What do I want to imagine for my son? And then how do I keep focusing on that? So I'm leading from that place, not from a place of reactivity and survival, but I'm leading from a place of potential abundance and, like, that there's hope. That's why we're all here, because we do believe that there's something. And so I want to lead from that place.
I think Harry and I have been on that journey as parents, as leaders, and actually just this morning we're talking about what happens when we do imagine a world, and then we work towards that instead of being, so impacted by all the things that we don't have control over anyway. And I didn't realize that we were doing that. So thank you for telling us that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I have been listening to some different writers, and they were talking about how, part of thinking about abundance is really thinking about the things that we have right in this moment. There's lots of ways that I'm privileged that other people are not. And, I really think about how I use that privilege for the good of my community, but also, like, how do I start to really imagine what that could mean outside of myself?
Well, we need more abundance in our life, and we need more Marisol in our life. And unfortunately, we've gone over time, because your wisdom and your insight, really, they're food for my soul, and I think everyone else's. Any last bit of advice or any last thing you'd like to leave folks before we close out here today?
Yeah, I think that, to Harry's point, I think that, mental health is not, if we're seeking out help for mental health, that's the best thing that we can do for ourselves. Like, if I'm sick, I typically call a doctor. And there's a stigma around mental health And, it's all really based on our biology and our physiology and who we are as people. And there's nothing to feel shame about. So I think breaking that shame, especially as leaders, like you said, we sometimes don't want to let the cracks show, but the more that we do that, we're healing ourselves and we're healing the people that we lead. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Wow. Friend, I appreciate you so much. I hope that people today are taking away not only some real clear, tangible action items that they can do for themselves, but that we've created community where we could talk about this, normalize this, and also amplify that there are folks like you in our familia, in our community, doing the good work as experts that have that cultural relevancy connected to it, but the expertise. And so I hope people continue. You have a podcast, you have newsletters, you need to find this woman.
Absolutely.
She may regret never putting her on blast that way. But you need Marisol in your life as much as we do. And I am just so grateful that you joined us on Summit Up. I think to sum it up for all of us, what I really got out of this is abundance is powerful, community is powerful. At the foundation, the self-reflection is critical, and we have to begin to do this. And if you're having a bad day, and you're thinking, how am I going to get through this? I think this notion of even taking 30 seconds of breathing and just grounding. And so you have given us so much today. I don't want it to end.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who have joined. We'll jump off and we'll respond to some of your questions. Marisol, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being a light in some of this darkness right now, not just for us, but for so many in our community.
Oh, I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.